In the twilight of World War II, Europe was a continent shattered beyond recognition, its people scattered, its cities in ruins. The air was thick with the remnants of conflict, the acrid smell of burning wood, the hum of distant artillery, and the constant tension that seemed to grip every corner of every war-torn city. Amidst the rubble, there were stories of loss, of survival, and of forgotten lives. In a small, desolate town in Eastern Europe, two sisters, Anna and Elsa, navigated the broken streets with a quiet, resigned determination. The once thriving town had been reduced to a haunting ghost of its former self. Buildings lay half-collapsed, their walls crumbling like the fragile hopes of those who once lived within them. What had once been a bustling marketplace was now a deserted square, littered with debris, its echo only broken by the sound of wind sweeping through the abandoned streets. The war had arrived like an unstoppable force, leaving its indelible mark on everything it touched. Anna and Elsa had known happiness once, long before the bombs fell and the world turned dark. They had been children then, carefree, surrounded by a community that cared for them, and parents who, though not wealthy, gave them everything they could. The early days of the war had stolen that life from them. Their father, a shopkeeper, had been taken away in the first wave of occupation. Their mother, trying desperately to shield them from the horrors that came with the invading forces, had fallen ill, and within months, she too had passed away. In the span of a year, the world Anna and Elsa had known was reduced to nothing but fleeting memories and the bitter taste of survival. The sisters were now orphaned, their names no longer known beyond the crumbling ruins of their home. The once familiar faces of their neighbors had long since disappeared, either evacuated or lost to the war. The few who remained were hollow-eyed and hardened, caught in their own struggle for survival. With each passing day, the sisters grew more invisible, and the thought of being forgotten began to haunt them. They were just two more faces in the sea of displaced, desperate souls. In a world consumed by violence, where even the smallest act of kindness seemed impossible, Anna and Elsa were left to wonder if anyone would notice their suffering. Starving and alone, they wandered the desolate streets each day in search of food. The reality of life under occupation was brutal, especially for civilians who had no recourse but to beg, scavenge, or barter for scraps. The town, now occupied by British forces, was a bitter reminder of the war's far-reaching consequences. The soldiers, though ostensibly liberators, seemed no different from the forces that had come before them. They marched through the streets with cold, regimented precision, their eyes forward, their actions mechanical, leaving behind a trail of fear and uncertainty. For Anna and Elsa, the British soldiers were just another part of the occupying force, another symbol of power and indifference. The sisters knew their lives had little value to these foreign soldiers. In fact, many of the townspeople had started to view the British not as liberators, but as conquerors. The sisters, however, had no illusions about the kindness or intentions of their oppressors. It was a hard, cold world, and there was little room for the weak or vulnerable. Anna and Elsa's most pressing fear was that they would simply be overlooked, that their suffering would be dismissed, not because of malice, but because no one had the time or the will to care for the likes of them. In the shadow of the war, the idea of charity felt like a distant memory, and kindness had become something reserved for those who could afford it, not the forgotten and starving. One afternoon, while searching for scraps near a British encampment, Anna and Elsa were stopped by a British soldier. The sisters froze, expecting an encounter filled with threats or harsh words. But instead of the expected cruelty, they were met with an unexpected silence. The soldier, a man in his mid-20s with a weary face and tired eyes, stood before them, his uniform tattered from the harsh realities of war. He appeared just as broken as the town they were in, but in his eyes was something different, something the sisters hadn't seen in the eyes of the soldiers who had passed them by before, a flicker of humanity. The soldier didn't speak immediately, his gaze shifting from Anna to Elsa, as if sizing them up. He didn't seem to see them as nameless, faceless victims of the war. His eyes softened, and for a moment he seemed to struggle with something, a feeling, perhaps, of guilt or sympathy. Then, with a quick motion, he reached into his pack and pulled out a small bundle of apples. The apples were not much, but in a world where food was as scarce as hope, they were worth their weight in gold. Without a word, the soldier extended them toward the sisters. Anna and Elsa stared at the apples, their minds racing. It was hard to believe what they were seeing. The soldier's hand trembled slightly as he held out the fruit, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. This act of kindness was so foreign to the sisters that it felt like a trick, a test of some kind, one meant to lure them into a false sense of security. Could they trust him? Was this soldier really offering them food without any ulterior motive? Or would this moment of seeming charity be followed by cruelty, a punishment for accepting such a simple, human gesture in a world that had stripped them of all things human? Anna hesitated. Elsa, ever the more cautious of the two, tugged at her sister's sleeve, as if warning her not to take what might be poison or worse. They had learned to be suspicious of every offering, to question the kindness of strangers. And yet there was something about this soldier that made Anna pause. His face, etched with the fatigue of war, carried no malice. It was not the expression of a conqueror, but of someone who had seen too much, someone who, like them, had been touched by the brutality of the world around him. Slowly, tentatively, Anna reached out and took the apples. The soldier nodded, his gesture quiet and simple, yet filled with meaning. He didn't stay long. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the distance as quickly as he had appeared. For a moment, Anna and Elsa stood in stunned silence, clutching the apples as though they were the most precious things in the world. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in. It wasn't just the food that had stunned them. It was the recognition of their humanity, the acknowledgement that someone had seen them, that they had not been completely forgotten in the madness of war. As they made their way back to their shelter, the sisters felt a strange sense of hope creeping in. The war had taken so much from them, but for a brief moment, it had given them something back. It had reminded them that kindness still existed, that even in the darkest corners of the world, there were glimmers of light. The apples, though small and simple, had become a symbol of something much larger, of a world not entirely consumed by hatred, a world where even the smallest act of compassion could have a profound effect. It was an act that would stay with Anna and Elsa for the rest of their lives. They would remember the soldier's tired eyes, the way he had looked at them not as victims but as fellow human beings. They would remember the apples and the silence that had followed, and how in that silence, something deeper was spoken than any words could have conveyed. For a brief moment, the war had stopped mattering, and all that remained was the quiet, powerful connection between two sisters and a soldier who had, for a fleeting instant, reminded them that even in the heart of war, kindness had the power to survive. The days following that quiet, unspoken exchange were etched in Anna and Elsa's minds with a clarity that made them both hesitant and hopeful. The world around them remained as bleak and oppressive as it had been before, but something had shifted. The town, still under the watchful eyes of the British soldiers, continued its grim daily routine. The sounds of gunfire and distant artillery became a constant backdrop, as if the land itself were groaning under the weight of the ongoing conflict. Yet, amidst this all, the sisters felt a subtle, unspoken change in the air. The act of kindness they had experienced was not something that could simply be ignored or forgotten. It had become a lingering question in their minds, a question that challenged the harsh narrative of the war. Sergeant Thomas Harper, the soldier who had given them the apples, had disappeared into the camp, leaving no trace except for the impact of his gesture. He was just one among many, one soldier in a vast army of men stationed in the town. To Anna and Elsa, the British were simply the occupying force, a distant, faceless presence that had come from across the seas. But now, after that brief, unexpected moment, Harper had become something more than just a uniformed man. He was a reminder that kindness could exist, even in the most unlikely of places. The sisters found themselves haunted by the simplicity of it all. One soldier, one small gesture, and the weight of humanity that lay behind it. What was it about him that made his kindness so different from the rest? Was it genuine, or was it simply an act, a calculated move to make them trust him before the inevitable cruelty of war took hold again? Elsa's skepticism remained high. She had seen too much in the last few years to believe that anything could be purely good. Her heart, however, was not so easily closed off. Something about the soldier's eyes, the weariness they held, made her wonder if perhaps there was more to the world than what they had been forced to endure. Days passed, and the routine of survival continued. The sisters scavenged, begged when they could, and did their best to avoid the soldiers whenever possible. They knew that the British soldiers, while not as brutal as the occupying forces from before, were still soldiers of war, bound by their own codes and rules, a world away from the civilian lives they had once led. Yet there was a constant tension in the air, a palpable fear that at any moment, the kindness they had briefly experienced would evaporate, leaving them with nothing but the cold reality of the war once more. But the strange sense of hope that had taken root inside them refused to fade. It lingered like a spark, small and fragile but persistent, pushing them to look at the British soldiers not as faceless occupiers but as individuals. It was an unsettling shift. For years, Anna and Elsa had learned to see soldiers as part of the machinery of war, as part of the oppressive system that sought to break their will and crush their spirit. But now, in the wake of that brief exchange with Sergeant Harper, they began to wonder if there could be more to the men in uniform than they had ever allowed themselves to see. Could they too be human? Could they too experience doubt, fear, and empathy? A week after the incident, while scavenging near the outskirts of the British encampment, the sisters were startled to find a familiar face. Sergeant Harper appeared again, though this time, he wasn't alone. He was walking with a group of soldiers, all of whom seemed just as weary as he did. As they approached the sisters, the soldiers moved with a practiced indifference, eyes fixed forward, minds focused on whatever task lay ahead. But Harper's gaze caught Anna's, and without breaking stride, he gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. The sisters froze, unsure of what to do. In the years they had spent living in this war-torn world, the instinct to run from danger had become second nature. But something held them in place, a silent understanding between them and Harper. This was no longer a stranger offering charity, it was something more complex. This was an individual, a man who had witnessed the same horrors they had, who had experienced the same confusion, the same desperation. They were not so different after all. Later that evening, as the sisters huddled together in their small, makeshift shelter, the significance of the encounter began to sink in. They had been seen again, but this time, it was not by an enemy. It was by a soldier who, in his own way, had acknowledged their humanity. The enormity of the situation weighed heavily on them. The British soldiers, whom they had once viewed with only suspicion and fear, now seemed more like a complicated mirror, reflecting not just the brutality of war but the possibility of something better, something more human. Anna, ever the optimist, felt a strange surge of gratitude. She didn't know why Sergeant Harper had come back, or why he had acknowledged them once more, but she couldn't deny the flicker of hope that burned in her chest. She wanted to believe that the world hadn't lost all its goodness, that there were still people out there who cared, who could see beyond the violence and the destruction. Elsa, on the other hand, remained guarded. She had learned long ago that hope was a dangerous thing to cling to. Hope led to disappointment, and disappointment led to pain. But despite herself, even she could feel the stirrings of something deep inside her, a faint glimmer of trust that she wasn't ready to extinguish completely. As the days passed, the soldiers began to move with more regularity through the town, their patrols growing more frequent. But Sergeant Harper's presence, though still fleeting, was felt by the sisters in a new way. He was no longer just a figure of authority, he had become something more. He was a reminder that the brutality of war did not have to erase all traces of compassion. And yet, this was the complexity of war. It was both brutal and tender, cruel and kind. In a world where morality was often gray, where survival sometimes required the sacrifice of one's own values, the sisters found themselves wrestling with questions they had never considered before. On one particularly cold morning, Anna and Elsa found themselves near the edge of town, once again searching for any remnants of food they could find. The town was eerily quiet, the sound of distant gunfire the only reminder that the war was still ongoing. As they picked through the rubble of what had once been a thriving marketplace, they saw a familiar figure approaching. It was Sergeant Harper again, but this time, he was carrying something in his hand. At first, they thought it was nothing more than a bundle of supplies, perhaps a bag of food or a blanket. But as he drew closer, the sisters could see that it was more than that. Harper stopped a few feet away from them, his face drawn in the way that only war could shape it. He didn't speak immediately, but his eyes held a certain understanding. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he extended his hand toward them, offering a bundle wrapped in a ragged cloth. Anna, her heart pounding, stepped forward cautiously. She wasn't sure what to expect. This could be another act of kindness, or it could be something else entirely. But as her hands reached out to take the offering, she realized it was something far more valuable than she could have anticipated. Inside the cloth were several pieces of bread, some dried meats, and a few more apples. It was food, real food, something that, for them, felt like a miracle. This time, the moment felt different. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about the connection that had formed between them and this soldier, between two sisters and a man who had seen them, truly seen them, in a world that seemed bent on erasing their existence. Sergeant Harper did not speak, but the look in his eyes said everything. He wasn't just handing them food. He was offering something deeper, something that transcended the boundaries of war, something that suggested there might still be goodness left in the world. And as the sisters accepted his gift, they understood something profound, that even in the darkest moments, even in the heart of conflict, humanity could still shine through. The war was not over, and the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. But for that moment, in the quiet exchange between them and Harper, they felt the weight of war lift, if only for a second. And in that second, they knew they had been given something that no weapon or army could ever take away: their dignity, their humanity, and the hope that perhaps, just perhaps, kindness could survive even in the most brutal of times. In the days that followed, the strange, fleeting kindness from Sergeant Harper began to ripple through the atmosphere like a small but undeniable force. Though the world outside remained as cruel and unforgiving as it had been since the war's arrival, something subtle had changed in the hearts of Anna and Elsa. The sisters, once uncertain and wary, now found themselves tangled in a web of emotions that they could hardly articulate. It wasn't just the apples or the food Harper had given them. It was something more profound, something deeper that had stirred in their hearts, a quiet realization that perhaps, even in the most desperate of times, there was a way to see each other, to acknowledge each other's humanity. Each day, the sisters navigated the broken streets of their town with greater care, aware now not only of the dangers that lurked in the shadows but also of the unexpected moments that could emerge from the cracks of war. They could no longer see the British soldiers simply as a monolithic force. Sergeant Harper's gesture had made them question the simplicity with which they had categorized everyone. In truth, the soldiers, like everyone else, were just people, individuals who, for reasons beyond their own control, were caught in the tumult of history. They too were men and women with their own stories, their own burdens. Some were there out of duty, others out of necessity. But there was a possibility, however small, that among them might be someone who saw the world as they did, not as enemies or occupiers, but as fellow human beings, struggling just to survive. But despite the flicker of hope in their hearts, Anna and Elsa remained cautious. They were survivors of a war that had taught them to be suspicious, to guard themselves against the whims of others. Every kindness, no matter how genuine, carried the potential for betrayal. The sisters had learned this the hard way. When their home had been destroyed, when they had been abandoned by their countrymen, they had seen firsthand how quickly survival could eclipse compassion. In this world, kindness could be a luxury, something reserved for those who had enough to spare, or perhaps for those who had nothing left to lose. In the face of such uncertainty, the sisters had learned that even the smallest acts of humanity could quickly become dangerous, used as tools to manipulate and control. The British soldiers, though not as ruthless as the German forces that had occupied their town earlier in the war, were still part of an occupying force. Their presence, while perhaps less violent, was no less intrusive. And yet, in the weeks that followed their encounter with Sergeant Harper, the sisters began to notice a subtle shift. It was as if the soldiers were beginning to see them, not as faceless victims of the war, but as individuals, as human beings. The soldiers no longer marched past them with indifference, their gazes locked forward, their minds elsewhere. Instead, there were moments when they paused, when they acknowledged the sisters with a nod or a glance, as though recognizing them for the first time. These small acts of recognition, though seemingly insignificant in the larger scope of the war, meant everything to Anna and Elsa. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were no longer invisible. They were no longer just two orphaned girls struggling to survive in a world that had long since abandoned any pretense of decency. The soldiers, though still distant and guarded, had begun to recognize their presence, to see them as more than mere shadows in the ruined town. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the flicker of hope alive in their hearts. Days turned into weeks, and the sisters found themselves drawn into an uneasy pattern. They would walk the streets of the town, scavenging for food, avoiding the soldiers when they could, but also searching for the moments when those soldiers might show them that fleeting bit of humanity they had come to crave. At night, they would sit together in their small shelter, piecing together the remnants of their lives, trying to make sense of what had happened to them and to the world around them. They would talk in hushed voices about the war, about their memories of a time before everything had fallen apart, and about the strange kindness they had received from the British soldier. The quiet moments were sacred to them, and in those moments, they began to dream again, not of grand futures, but of simple things: safety, food, a home, a life beyond the war. It was on one such evening, as the fading light of dusk crept across the broken landscape, that they saw him again. Sergeant Harper appeared once more, walking alone along the same path he had taken the day he gave them the apples. This time, however, there was something different in his stride, something more purposeful, more deliberate. His uniform, once ragged and worn, now seemed slightly cleaner, as though he had taken more care with it. His eyes, too, seemed more alert, more focused, as though he were searching for something or someone. Anna and Elsa stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. They had been conditioned to avoid soldiers, to keep their heads down, to never attract attention. But something in Harper's manner stopped them. There was a quiet, almost unspoken understanding between them, a recognition that the world they were living in was no longer simple, no longer black and white. For a brief, fragile moment, they saw him not as a soldier, but as a fellow traveler in the wilderness of war. He too was lost. He too had seen the horrors of the world around them. As Harper drew closer, he glanced at the sisters and slowed his pace, his eyes meeting Anna's in that quiet, knowing way. He didn't say anything at first, but his presence felt different. It wasn't just the familiarity of seeing him again, it was something more, something deeper. He didn't look at them as soldiers look at civilians. He didn't look at them as prisoners or as threats. He looked at them as people. Finally, after a long, awkward pause, he spoke. His voice was low, hoarse, as though he hadn't used it much lately. "Are you two all right?" His question was simple, yet the sincerity behind it struck both sisters with a force they weren't prepared for. It wasn't a question meant to be answered with a mere yes or no. It was an invitation, an acknowledgement of the shared reality they all lived in. The sisters exchanged a glance. Elsa, ever cautious, opened her mouth to respond, but Anna spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're surviving," she said, the words coming out almost like a confession. It was the truth, nothing more, nothing less. They were surviving, but just barely. Harper nodded, as though he understood more than they had said. For a moment, there was only silence between them, the kind of silence that felt too heavy to break. Then, almost without thinking, Harper reached into his pack and pulled out a small bundle. Unwrapping it, he revealed another set of apples, fewer than the last time, but still an offering. "This is all I have," he said quietly, his voice betraying the exhaustion that hung over him. "But it's yours." Anna hesitated for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. She could feel Elsa's eyes on her, could sense the unspoken tension between them. Could they trust him again? Could they accept his kindness without feeling like they were being manipulated? For so long, they had relied on their instincts, on the lessons they had learned in a world where trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. But something in Harper's eyes, something that had always been there, beneath the surface, convinced Anna that this was real. This wasn't a trick. This wasn't a game. Slowly, Anna stepped forward and took the apples from him. For the briefest of moments, their hands brushed. It was a fleeting contact, almost imperceptible, but it carried a weight of meaning that neither of them could ignore. The simple act of receiving something from another person, of allowing themselves to be vulnerable, was something Anna hadn't allowed herself to do in years. In that moment, she felt the walls she had built around her heart start to crumble, just a little. Harper nodded, his eyes meeting hers one last time before he turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the gathering shadows of the night. But something had changed in that exchange. The act of kindness, which had once seemed so foreign to the sisters, had now become a quiet reminder that even in the darkest moments, there were still threads of light, however faint they might be. It was a small gift, a brief encounter, but it was enough to keep the flicker of hope alive. In a world that had turned cold and unforgiving, Sergeant Harper had given them more than just food. He had given them something they had almost forgotten existed, a reason to believe that, despite everything, humanity could still find a way to endure. The following weeks unfolded in a strange rhythm for Anna and Elsa, as if their lives had become a series of fleeting moments, each one held in a delicate balance between despair and hope. The town, still held under the oppressive grip of the British occupation, seemed to carry on with a heavy, mournful sigh. Each day, the sisters ventured out to search for food, to find whatever scraps they could, always moving cautiously through the streets, always alert. The world beyond their small shelter was unrecognizable, distant, foreign, and full of uncertainty. Yet, despite the fear and the constant reminder of their vulnerability, something had shifted in their hearts. The kindness they had encountered in Sergeant Harper's simple gestures had planted a seed of hope, one that grew despite their best efforts to remain emotionally detached from it. In the midst of this tentative hope, there was a darkness they could not ignore. Life under occupation had stripped them of everything they once took for granted. The sisters had been forced to adapt to a brutal new reality, one where trust was a rare commodity, and survival meant outwitting those who might otherwise help or harm. The streets were filled with fear, not only from the soldiers but from the townspeople themselves. The war had drawn everyone into a cruel contest for what little remained: food, shelter, safety. The collapse of their society had left everyone scrambling for anything that could keep them alive another day. And in such a world, loyalty was often a currency more valuable than kindness. One evening, as the sisters returned to their shelter after another fruitless search, they found that it had been ransacked. Their meager possessions, clothing, the small amount of food they had managed to scavenge, a few cherished keepsakes, were gone. The walls of their home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a reminder of their vulnerability, a place no longer safe. The only sound in the room was the faint rustling of wind outside, as if the world itself had been drained of life. The realization hit them with the force of a cold wave. They had been betrayed. The very people they had once trusted, those who had lived alongside them, had taken from them in their own struggle for survival. There was no one to turn to. The only law in a town so broken was that of the strongest, and it seemed that Anna and Elsa were not among them. For the first time in a long while, Elsa felt something deeper than just fear. She felt anger. Anger at the world for what it had become, at the people who had once been neighbors and now were nothing more than desperate scavengers. But more than that, she felt a deep betrayal, the kind that gnawed at her insides and made her question everything. It wasn't just the loss of their few belongings. It was the loss of their sense of safety, the loss of a world where kindness was possible. The brutality of war had taken everything from them, and now it seemed that even the simplest human connections had been corrupted. Anna, too, felt the sting of betrayal, but her response was different. Where Elsa's anger was sharp and direct, Anna's was more inward, more reflective. She couldn't help but think of Sergeant Harper, of the kindness he had shown them when they were starving. In a world where survival seemed to trump all, he had chosen to reach out, to acknowledge them as human beings. But that moment, like everything else, had felt fleeting. She couldn't help but wonder if it had been an illusion, a temporary escape from the harsh reality of war. Could it be that the kindness they had experienced was just another fleeting moment in a world where true compassion had no place? She longed for more than just the crumbs of generosity, more than the brief flickers of light that seemed to disappear just as quickly as they appeared. The sisters spent the next few days in a haze of confusion and uncertainty. Without their belongings, without a place to call home, they had nothing left but each other and the hope that somewhere, hidden beneath the surface of this broken world, there was still something worth believing in. They had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The few people still left in the town were as lost as they were, wrapped in their own struggle for survival. The British soldiers, though less brutal than the German forces that had once occupied the town, were still in occupying power. They were not their friends. They were not their protectors. They were simply another part of the machinery of war, another layer of violence that the sisters had to navigate. One evening, just as the shadows of the day began to lengthen, Anna and Elsa found themselves once again near the edge of the British encampment. It was a place they had avoided since their last encounter with Sergeant Harper, but something in Anna's heart urged her forward. She couldn't explain it, couldn't put it into words, but she felt a strange pull, as though they were meant to be there. Perhaps it was foolishness, perhaps it was the remnants of a hope she wasn't ready to let go of. But the truth was, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this war, something deeper than the violence and the fear that had defined their existence for so long. As they approached, the sisters saw that the camp was quieter than usual, the soldiers moving with a kind of lethargy that came with the endless grind of war. Anna's heart beat a little faster, her breath quickening as she searched the faces of the soldiers. And then, like a beacon in the darkness, she saw him, Sergeant Harper. He was standing at the edge of the camp, his back to the sisters, his posture rigid, as though deep in thought. For a moment, it seemed as though the world around them had fallen away, leaving just the two of them, Harper and the sisters, alone in the stillness. Without thinking, Anna took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. Elsa reached out to stop her, her hand gripping her sister's arm with a force that spoke of the years of caution they had lived by. But Anna shook her head, her eyes fixed on Harper. She didn't know why, but she felt the need to approach him, to see him again, to understand why he had shown them kindness when no one else had. "Anna, wait," Elsa whispered, but Anna didn't listen. She had already taken another step toward him, her footsteps quiet on the dust-covered ground. She could feel Elsa's gaze on her, the unspoken concern in her sister's eyes, but she couldn't stop herself. There was something she needed to understand, something she needed to see. When she was close enough, Harper turned, his eyes locking onto hers in that same quiet way he always had. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was thick, but there was an unspoken understanding in his gaze, something that transcended the uniforms, the war, the brokenness of the world around them. It was a recognition, a shared humanity that neither of them had been able to ignore. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice low, but there was no hesitation, no pretense in it. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I thought I could make a difference, even in small ways." His words hung in the air, weighted with the burden of someone who had seen too much, who had been shaped by the chaos of the world in ways that neither Anna nor Elsa could fully understand. He seemed so much smaller than the uniform he wore, as though the weight of the war had crushed him, leaving only a man who was trying, desperately, to hold onto whatever pieces of decency he had left. Anna didn't know what to say. For a moment, she stood there, the words caught in her throat. She didn't know if she could forgive him, if forgiveness was even possible in a world where survival was the only rule that mattered. But she couldn't ignore the fact that he had been there for them when no one else had, that he had seen them when everyone else had looked away. The sisters had been abandoned, both by their countrymen and by the world, but Sergeant Harper had not abandoned them. He had given them something they hadn't had in so long: recognition, acknowledgement, a brief respite from the cruelty of their lives. "I don't know what you've been through," Anna said softly, "but I know we've all lost something. I don't know if this will change anything. But thank you. For the apples, for what you've done." Harper nodded slowly, his eyes lowering as if the weight of her words had settled on him. He didn't say anything more, there was nothing more to say. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tattered piece of cloth. When he opened it, Anna saw that it was another small bundle of food, a meager offering that seemed almost laughable in the face of the world they lived in. But to Anna and Elsa, it was everything. "Take it," he said quietly. I don't have much, but it's something. It's all I can give." The sisters took the bundle, their hands shaking slightly as they accepted it. The world around them seemed to fall silent in that moment, the noise of the war fading into the background as they stood there, connected by something far more powerful than the violence that raged outside their lives. As Harper turned to leave, Anna felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, the fragile, delicate thread of trust beginning to weave itself between them, even in the shadow of all the brutality. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if the world would ever truly be kind again. But in that moment she knew one thing for